So we developed, this is the front end tool. This is the one that allows students to collect their dots. So I'll show you the dot plot tool here real quick. You can see our grid with a little bit of explanations and some video instructions on how to do this either on a desktop or a mobile device. And as a student, you would come in here and you would begin, and you would have two pieces of information. You would have your student identification and your school code. So we have a fake school called Professor X Academy, and I will do student 102. Oh, he's only got one class. Let's see if I have a better one. I was playing around with editing classes the other day, and so I think here we go. So this student, you can see, has 3 classes: Heroic Myth, Living with a Secret Identity, and Superpowers and Ethics. And so they are asked to then drag each class onto the grid. So Heroic Myth, I find challenging, but I don't really like it too much, so I drop it there. Living with a Secret Identity isn't particularly difficult, but it's fun, and I enjoy it, so I put it there. And Superpowers and Ethics, I really get into those conversations, so I think I love it, and it's extremely challenging. So I've placed my dots, I'm done, and that's the extent of the time it takes a student to give us the feedback. This requires that a student has the ability to conceptualize a 2-dimensional axis where they can effectively work with 2 variables at the same time. We've thought about, as we begin to try and roll this out to even younger students, that we will separate out those 2 axes and just simply ask them, how much do you love or hate the class you're in, and how hard is it?
And I read in your note that your first use would be in a district that was grades 4 through 12. And we have, in fact, used this with 4th graders a little bit. We've generally started with our 5th graders simply because our middle school starts in 5th grade. And the division head there is behind it, and but we have experimented with 4th grade. We don't, and we think our 4th graders certainly can do this.
We've actually talked to them about using it with Blue Skin. With so much work with them.
And that's probably a 6. Is that a 6 through?
It's probably a 6 through 12 school. So I told you 4th grade because you had said you were thinking about going as low as 4th grade. I figured it's easier to do fewer than more than we said.
Right. Sure.
Let me pop over to the analysis side, if I can type fast enough. Hopefully I typed that right. Here we go. So once the data, since this is just a live data tool, as soon as you enter those pieces of information, you can visualize it. And so if we go into, and we'll show you our Wellington data because the other data is kind of meaningless.
And if our Wellington data shows up in the Wichita Press, we'll know where it came from.
Exactly. So this is our visualization tool that allows us to see the data. It'll give us quick things like numbers, total numbers in each quadrant, percentage of those results in each quadrant, the average location of all those dots is represented by the big blue dot, and then you get the actual coordinates of that average, so you can see how you average in the x direction, which would be a rating of 40. This is on a 0 to 200 scale in each direction. So we're at a plus 40 here for our love it axis, and we're at a plus 34 from our challenged, unchallenged axis. And so that gives us a way to do some comparisons. So what you're seeing here is overall, this is every single dot for every single class.
And let me just say this, that when we started the first measures that we did a year ago, we were seeing in the engaged quadrant, the challenged and love it quadrant, somewhere between 45 and 50%. And in the board quadrant, the unchallenged and hate it, we were showing somewhere around 12 to 15%. And one of the things we really think is exciting is that since we've talked about this, the numbers have significantly changed for the better. So one of our questions as we started with this was, did knowing this and talking about it necessarily give us the ability to change it? Was this something that could be changed by conscious practice? And so far, the early answer seems to us to be yes.
And I love looking at this data because you get to see things like human artifact. You'll notice there's these kind of faint X across the screen where students apparently tend to like to put things sort of equally along that X equals Y line, which I think is kind of interesting. And then you get these really intense locations at the corners where people feel extremely strongly, and so they kind of dump their dots in the corners, which I think is kind of interesting too. And you get this big chunk in the middle where people are sort of undecided, and so put it right in the middle. But then the tool allows us to do some things like average view. This allows us to see, this is a average of that student's dots. So each dot now represents a student's overall opinion of all of their classes as opposed to all of their individual dots. And you can see, obviously, as we average, we get a little bit less variation. Tools like, or views like this get to allow us to come in here and say, you know, that student is having a fairly negative experience. If their average is there, that means that they may have several dots in the undesired quadrants, and we might be able to then zero in on that student and find out what's going on. If I go back to the overall tool, we now have filters, and we can begin to break things down. For example, by grade, we can pull up our 12th graders and see how they're doing. We have 74% of our 12th grader responses for this particular time period in the engaged quadrant, so we would think that would be particularly good. And here's where we can begin to drill down. We can display identifiers and click, and we now get student identifiers, and so we could come in here and say, okay, let's say student 9201 is particularly challenged. I mean, they've put that all the way at the max and they're not enjoying it. So we might go as a division head or a dean to that student and just start a conversation about, hey, how's it going? We're not going to talk about their dots. We're not going to come in and say, hey, you're 9201 and you put your dots in a very, bad place. We might just start a conversation that says, hey, how's it going? How's classes? Are you behind? Are you whatever? So,
and we've been very clear that we won't share individuals' dots with either parents or with teachers. That at the division head level, we might take a look at this, but we wouldn't. We think in order to get good data, they have to be assured that they're not going to be called in to talk about their dots.
And so with a few other filters, you can begin to bop around through.
And on this one, John, would you go to 8th grade geometry? I just want to point out one of the interesting conversations we've had with one of our teachers. So we look at 8th grade geometry. What happened to 8th grade geometry?
Oh, there it is.
Okay, I thought maybe we'd gotten rid of 8th grade geometry. So it's a small group, and this teacher is, we think extraordinarily effective by every measure we have, and the dots tend to confirm that. We then looked at her 10th grade geometry class, which was Geometry 3, and we said, isn't that interesting? And as we were talking with the teacher wanted to see her dots and then wanted to talk about it. And so we started to hypothesize that perhaps, since these are all geometry students, that our 8th graders who are taking geometry are our top students, and we would of course expect that they would be challenged and love it more than our 10th grade, who are our more remedial students. So then we looked at the other two sections of 10th grade geometry, which are taught by a different teacher. And we saw that her 10th grade geometry was significantly different, far more on the challenged and hate it side than the other teachers, which then made her say, well, gosh, I guess it's not just that 10th graders are that way, since another teacher is having a different experience. If we continue to go through this, we might show this teacher's advanced senior class, which would look very much like the 8th grade class, and what the teacher was then dealing with, or her conclusion, and I think an appropriate one, was that she does very well with our top-end students. This is her advanced calculus, one of her advanced calculus classes, and less so with the students who were less mathematical, which has been, I think, a really interesting thing for her to start to think about and work through, and something that her division head is talking with her about as well. She's we think, a superb teacher, and we find that this is the kind of data that she really wants to try to help her figure out what some of her strengths and challenges are.
And then we provide a summary view for teachers. So let's see if I put in something like 12.1 and so these are now teacher reports, and I don't know whose report this will be. That's a health class. That one doesn't have any data in it. Let's try that one.
And one of the things with the data that John is showing, we've just discovered that our senior electives, for the most part, didn't get into this set of data, which is why we had so few dots in the senior class.
This would be a teacher report where you can see your classes here that you're teaching in this top sets. You'll see the dot plot for each of your classes. And then to give you some context, that will give you dot plots for those departments. So for example, the social studies classes, you could then compare to the overall results of all social study classes. And
you'll notice, for instance, that the teacher here, his social studies classes are in the 80s in the engaged quadrant, except one in 62 and 2 in the 80s, and the average in social studies is 68. So just gives you some context of where that stands relative to others.
And as a teacher, I would look here and see social studies 7th section 2 is actually in the grind quadrant. And so you might wonder, like, as you might think as a teacher, you know, what am I doing differently? Is this the class that's at the end of the day maybe? What is it that's different here than all of my other experiences and the average in general? And then you also get grade level comparisons so that you can see whether or not it really is just, oh, those 7th graders are always a trouble. And then you see that, well, overall, 7th graders have a little bit lower positive experience. So maybe there is a little correlation with just 7th graders in general aren't as happy about their experience or aren't as engaged. And so maybe there is a little story there, but it gives you some context. So this is sort of what our teacher report looks like. And I'll just go back to home here and Rob, anything else or questions?
Well, where we stand with this is that we had started doing this work, and then I spoke to a group of independent school heads from the central states, and we had 9 schools that joined us, 5 of whom are actually collecting data at this moment as part of our pilot. We keep believing that what we're finding seems to be significant and useful to the folks who use it. And you're the first people we've ever talked to who aren't in independent schools. So, and we've gotten through you, for those of you who didn't know, through Milt Darty, who's now an independent school head in Wichita, and one of our 10 schools that's working with us on this right now.
Questions?
Yeah, so when you say these other schools are working with you on that, what does that mean?
Well, 5 of the schools have started to enter their own data, and then essentially once they have entered the data, they're able to look at their own materials. At some point, we're going to come together and start to talk about what we're all seeing in the data that we've collected. But at present, they are all in their first iteration of collecting data from their students. And so essentially, we've had a couple of talks along the way, and now they can collect data and analyze and do what John just showed you whenever they feel like it. So
do you have some kind of a financial arrangement or something with them, or are you're just sharing it out of the goodness of your heart with them, or what does that look like?
They're part of a group that agreed on an initial, basically, research study. We agreed that we would form this group to try and set some norms and see if there's any additional pieces of information that we're missing in this dialogue. So they agreed to be in the project in terms of an initial study, and thus and they were willing also to be, raw alpha testers. So all the things that would go wrong when they try to bring, 200 kids together at that time, and then it doesn't work, they agreed not to get on our case. So.
And so you're kind of in a setting the norms process. Do you imagine that you'll be expanding, like what the norms are that you might be establishing? So I guess the question I would have would be students who are attending school at independent schools. Is that a different makeup of students than what you might find in a traditional public school? And what about rural versus metro and some of those? I'm just wondering where you might be going with you know?
Well, I think that's one of the things we're in fact going to find out if there are schools that are interested in pursuing this. So at present, we have a fairly small data set, but we're interested in expanding the use of this to the extent that other places find this to be interesting and useful. So we're in the early stages of that. We're looking at early adopters at the moment.
Has your data showed increased learning in those classes where they are challenged and loved it compared to the other way?
We don't have that data yet. And again, I think what we were aiming for was the belief simply that if students are challenged and love what they do, that they're going to be propelled to look for future challenge. And that's the assumption that we've been working on. When we started this, we really started this simply to see if we could improve practice here at the school. And the fact that this has been interesting to other people has been a delightful surprise. We did not start with this with the notion that this was a tool that we were going to share with the world. So,
and to answer the question of can engagement improve learning, we currently 2 years ago or 3 years ago when we started this conversation, we thought that the answer to that is yes, but we had to develop something that would allow us to measure engagement first, and so that's what we've now accomplished, I think, and now it's time for us, and our next step, at least at Wellington, is to begin to compare this engagement data to all of the other types of data that we have, like grades and assessment type information, as well as other factors that we've begun to measure.
And in fact, when we were using, until this fall, students participated anonymously. Without an identifier, so the idea of being able to correlate their engagement with any other personal measure was not where we were, and the tool wouldn't allow for that.
Well, just so you know, that's what we believe in here. Engagement doesn't prove data. Learning. But I was just wondering if you have that information to start up a conversation. To pull that data out and put it in front of a teacher. Are you giving these pilot schools some questions, or are you letting them develop their own dialogue with their teachers? How are you,
we're telling them about our experience, and when they have experiences, they're telling us, but we're significantly ahead of them. But we're leaving them to do it as they wish. We've said a couple of things. One, simply that we're asking that people not share individual student dots, whose dots belong to whom with parents or students, or teachers. We're asking for that. Other than that, no, we're not giving people particular guidelines. We're showing them what they can do with the data, and we're in part really interested to see what folks other than us are doing with it. So we don't have all the answers yet as to how best to use this material.
So when you go into a meeting with a teacher, and I'm sorry, I'm asking a lot of questions.
No, go ahead.
No, yeah, go ahead.
And they're sitting in the hate it, not challenging. What does that conversation sound like?
I'm sorry, I lost part of that. If they're where?
If they're in the hate it and they're not challenged, what does that conversation sound like with a teacher in your school right now?
Well, I think part of what we're saying here is that we don't conclusively know whether a particular dot constellation is solely the issue of the teacher, the room space furniture, the students. So we've really been working in open-ended conversations in which the few teachers that we've had who've been in that circumstance have, I think, been really thoughtful and questioning why it is and what they do about it. So I've been really surprised. Again, we have very few teachers that fall into that circumstance.
I love how your matrix pans out. It looks great.
We do like our matrix, but one of the questions we had was, does it look very different from other folks? Because when we were the only ones doing it, and one of the questions we posed to our community is, and actually when we started and we were aiming for 50% in the engaged quadrant, our question was, is that good? What's a good number there? So part of what's been interesting is to start to define that. We have found a lot of cooperation among our teachers and we have not used this as a hammer in teacher evaluation. And there have been very few instances where the dots were particularly different from what other data was telling us. And I was talking with our upper school head on Thursday or Friday about a teacher who had received, all of our teachers in the upper school get evaluation comments from their students other than dots. And we had one teacher whose dots were on average not in a place she wanted them to be, but it was very consistent with what she was hearing in the student evaluation that she was receiving as well. So I think we've had no instances where we had a teacher with bad dots where we didn't already have concerns.
But we have had a case where teachers have had good dots where we thought just like anecdotally that they may not be a particularly engaging teacher because they teach in a particularly traditional manner, and it turns out their dots were significantly better. So maybe our preconceived notions were not accurate.
Yeah, I think we're a somewhat more progressive school than other schools in Columbus, which isn't saying a whole lot because Columbus is pretty traditional. But there have been a couple of instances where we've had traditional teachers whose dots were really good, and it's made us say, do we want to turn these people into B- progressive teachers or let them be A traditional teachers? And that's one for us to grapple with. So in some cases, it's really been healthy for us to think about where these dots fall.
So a question about the geometry teacher using as an example.
Right.
The 7th grade or 8th grade geometry, I can't remember, was an awesome class, showed awesome data. And then the sophomore geometry didn't. Did you find what might have been the problem there by conversation? Was there more hands-on applications in one? Or was it just because she was worked better with the upper level than the lower level? How did you work through that?
Well, I don't know that we've worked through that. I think that we've gotten a second set of dots. The first set was in October. She did a second set in January, and she expected to see that 10th grade class move significantly. There were 15 students in the class. She had, I think it was 6 in the engaged quadrant and 9 in the grind quadrant. And then on the second set, I think that's right. Are you going to get that, John?
Of the terms, engage and grind.
And then in the second set, she went to 6 and 7 with 2 students out sick, I think. So she did not see the kind of change that she was hoping to see, which caused for further questioning. Actually, if you look at the X bar, Y bar at the bottom, and what do we have for dates here, John? Oh, okay. So this is the second taking.
This is the second set.
Right. The X bar moved a little bit to the right. They hated it less by a little bit, and the Y bar moved down. They were a little less challenged than they were before, which gave us the bad question of, did she make them happier by not challenging them as much? And if that's the conclusion we reach, then we want to, then we're unhappy. That's not been consistent with other things that we've seen. So maybe we should show our other project in which we're trying to determine what tends to put people in the engaged quadrant. Do you have time to see another thing we're working on?
Yes, we do.
Okay, this is image engagement. This was an attempt to provide a way to collect information about what students find to be engaging, and the way the process works is, no, I will not, next, oops. We prompt students by providing them with an array of photos that they can describe, and so we're asking them to identify one of these 5 photos as to whether they believe they can determine where it would go on the grid. Like if they were in this class, would they say that they were a particular location in the grid? So if I took this particular, say this photo here, and I would say, that I think that is an engaged class, I might put it there on the grid, and then I'm going to go to the next screen, and now I'm going to describe in this text box here why I believe that this is an engaged class. So I might describe how students are asking questions, heads are up, etc. So I may go through a long description here as to why I think that these students are loving it and are challenged. And then I'll go next and I'll get another grid and I will attempt to pick one of those, classrooms, and I'll say where I think it goes. And it looks like they're playing. And so I'll describe playing, etc. And when you're done with 5 of those, you're done with that particular round of collection. And then what we do is we do analysis on that text in order to pull out a variety of real language sentiment and such. So we might get concepts about pedagogy, or we might get concepts about room layout or teacher position, etc. And Rob's initial analysis of the data from when he did this in a room with pictures on the wall really kind of showed us some interesting things about what measurables go with engagement, and then we could begin to talk about how do we adjust those variables and use the dot plots to measure to see whether or not the changes in say we change furniture layout, does that have an impact on actual measured engagement? If we change and tell teachers to lecture less or to have more group activity or whatever the pedagogy change we might have. So we're about to embark on an actual analytical version of this to try and modify some of those variables and see if we have impact.
Right. So when we did this as an experiment, as John said, we had 44 pictures on a wall. We asked students to take a picture in which they knew what quadrant they would be in if they were in that picture, and then asked them to give us descriptors, particularly on 4 different categories: teacher, student, room, space, furniture, and pedagogy. And then we collected all of what we got. We had 200 students go through that process. One of the things we wonder about is, would this be very different depending on location, school? Is there a school culture issue here? But we had some significant findings that we think have been useful in terms of trying to drive student engagement. And the room, space, furniture, we found that students, by and large, took pictures in which students were standing, in which there seemed to be some level of mobility, and that the engaged quadrant seemed all about that. So we have recently been in a furniture purchasing mode, and we've outfitted now about half of our classrooms with highly mobile rolling whiteboards, rolling chairs, rolling desks. So that was one of the findings in that category. We found when people were describing teachers in pictures in the engaged quadrant, that the number one thing that the students noted dealt with connectedness, teachers asking questions, supporting, helping. We thought this was really interesting. And last year we had a teacher who had terrible dots and bad reputation in all sorts of other ways. And it caused us to stop thinking so much about classroom management and more about the fact that she was a person who simply didn't connect, did not say hello to, didn't use students' names. So that just helped us to identify what we thought the issues were. It turns out she's no longer with us. We made very little progress. Then in the issue of pedagogy, one of the things that, again, the group work, collaboration seemed to be things that appeared in the engaged quadrant. But one of my favorite findings from that was that lecture appeared in all 4 quadrants. There was a good lecture is a good lecture. The interesting thing to us was that in the grind quadrant, the challenged and hate it, the only thing that appeared was lecture. So for us, it wasn't that lecture is good or bad, it was the degree of balance of lecture as part of your repertoire. Also, we had students wrote comments, and I liked one of them who put lecture in the unchallenged love it, what we call the entertained quadrant. And this student wrote, "I love it when the teacher starts to speak because then I can think about anything I want." So, and then what was the last one? Oh, and students, what they said about students in the pictures were all the things you'd want to hear for students to describe what students should be for a class to be engaged. It was, hardworking, active, questioning, and this all derived from looking at pictures. So this is a project that we've done here without the digitized format. And we don't have any other schools that have done this with us yet. We think this is a really interesting project to help define what are the things that we concretely want teachers to work on, what we want ourselves to work on in terms of furnishing classes, what we want, and what we want students to do in terms of their responsibility to make a class a truly engaging class. So,
how often do you suggest a school give this survey to students?
We're doing it once a trimester. We're trying to do it in the mid-trimester. We're trying to do it away from testing periods, exam periods and the like. We found that we were able to see some differences from period to period. We think that this could be used for specific purposes far more often if someone were trying to assess certain activities. But we think at least once a trimester has been good for us. Again, one of the things we'll be interested to see is if other schools do this in different ways and find that really productive.